TellyCast.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby. Welcome to this week's TellyCast. Bectu, the union for 40,000 staff, contract and freelance workers in the UK media and entertainment industries, recently declared an emergency as large numbers of TV professionals are facing unprecedented gaps in employment in the unscripted sector. This week, I'm chatting with the co-chairs of the UTVU, the Unscripted TV Union, and part of Bectu, to discuss the issues facing unscripted freelancers and search for some solutions. It's coming right up on this week's TellyCast. My guests this week are Viki Carter and James Taylor. James is a freelance co-executive producer and series producer in factual entertainment, and Viki is a freelance production executive across unscripted programming. They're co-chairs of the Unscripted TV Union, which is part of Bectu, the UK union representing over 40,000 staff, contract and freelance workers in the media and entertainment industries. Viki and James, welcome to TellyCast.
Thank you for having us.
Hello. How you doing?
Great to have you on the show, and there's lots going on which Bectu's involved with, some key topics that I'm looking forward to discussing as we go through the show. But first of all, for our listeners that may not be aware of you around the world or in the UK who may not have come across you, tell us about UTVU and Bectu for those who haven't come across you before.
Well, a lot of people here in the UK will have heard of Bectu as the union for TV, film and other communications industry professionals in the UK. The UTVU itself, which is the unscripted branch of Bectu, we've just branded it as Unscripted TV Union, is a relatively new part of the union. It only really came into being really as a result of the pandemic and the things that were going on, and a lot of freelancers realizing that they weren't represented really very well, and Bectu saw the gap in the market, so to speak, and created the unscripted branches, which is where and when I started to actively get involved, and Viki as well. We've been working together pretty much since then, haven't we, Viki?
Yeah.
Basically on unscripted shows. And I always say unscripted shows, certainly in the UK anyway, it's a really, really wide breadth of stuff. So it could be 24 hours in A&E. It could be Strictly Come Dancing. It could be Gardener's World. It could be Dickinson's Real Deal. It is a really wide range and type of programming. But I think the one thing they have in common is that they're all made in a similar way and use people and in production management roles and in editorial roles in a very similar way that you could probably cross from one to another and still understand how that program is going to be made.
And I think there are a lot of us in the industry who I've toyed with joining the union on and off probably for my whole career, but never really felt that I fitted anywhere because there was a production branch, but it was mostly films and drama. And it became apparent, as James said during the pandemic, that there was a need for an unscripted branch for all of us who didn't kind of feel that there was somewhere to sit, but felt that it would be useful to be in the union, and the union could do things for us, but also we could do things for the industry as part of the union. So that's why the unscripted branch was set up, because we work, we think, in a fairly unique way, and it makes sense to reflect that in our part of the union.
Okay, what's the fundamental differences then from a production perspective from scripted and unscripted, and what element of that wasn't being catered for the unscripted?
So in terms of unscripted, I think it's more to do with, and James jump in if I'm wrong here, but the union's always been set up pretty much on what we call a craft basis. So you've got a camera department, a sound department, and they deal with their own sort of area. We have people, for example, self-shooting producer directors who don't sit in the camera department, and lots of our roles cross over, and there isn't a natural place for us to sit. So it is a bit different to a lot of the other branches of the union because we are kind of cross-genre and we have lots of different skill sets in it. Like we say, we have production managers, but we also have assistant producers, researchers, producer directors, edit producers. But it makes sense, we think, within the context of how the unscripted industry works.
I think that's it, isn't it? I think in unscripted shows, we often have to wear more than one hat, which would probably put a bit of the fear of death into people who are working in scripted shows, which are a lot more regimented in terms of who does what. I think in unscripted, we tend to do more than one role, and we become very specialised at that. And I think sometimes that there has been, and still can be now, a bit of them and us between editorial roles and production roles within productions. And actually, I think the thing is, what we realised is, look, we don't need to argue with each other. We need to actually work together to make our part of the industry a better place. And actually, Justin, I think one thing that's really important to mention at this point, because it surprises a lot of people, and it still surprises me actually, that a difference between scripted and unscripted with the union is that you might have heard yourself, a lot of people have, that in scripted programs, there is an agreement in place in terms of terms and conditions. And there isn't one for unscripted shows. And so the cliche that people use is that it is a bit of a Wild West. I mean, it is, because there are no set terms and conditions.
Why not?
And so, well, have you got all day? Basically, a lot of it is historical reasons. The industry itself went very, very freelance over the last, or has gone very, very freelance over the last sort of 20 years or so. It certainly feels like a very different place to the one I entered when I started 20 years ago. And, I don't think it's been done maliciously. I just think it's a consequence of all these things happening. ITV and BBC used to make the vast majority of their programmes with their own in-house staff production teams. That doesn't happen anymore. They don't have those staff production teams anymore. So the burden of risk is placed on freelancers themselves as opposed to the broadcasters, and I guess also to an extent with the independent producers as well, because as we're seeing right now in the current crisis, they're struggling as much as the freelancers are because they're not getting the business that they're used to having. So these are all having trickle-down effects.
Well, I think one really important point on why not is because we've never collectively organised before. So drama has been a part of Bectu across numerous branches, and they have the power of a voice.
Is that due to budgets? Just simply be more bigger budgets involved, do you think? Does that have a part to play?
I don't think so. I think the transition from when it was largely a staff-based program-making industry to a freelance one happened very, very slowly. It didn't just happen overnight. And so I think things changed at such a slow pace that it took the pandemic for everyone to look around and say, I don't like this place that we're in right now. That is what I think has happened. And so that's why there's been a lot more organising since the pandemic, and why we've been a much more active branch, and why we've been holding our hands up and saying, hey guys, look, there's something broken here and we need to work together to fix it.
Let's talk about the pandemic, because obviously that has had huge implications for the commercial aspects of the industry, the shape of the industry, the number of people in the industry. Initially, it had a hugely positive effect, although obviously in the depths of lockdown, nobody could actually work. But once that started to loosen up, then the demand that was generated from a lot of the streamers and the boom that followed, really injected a lot of money. A lot of US studios were launching their own streamers. Massive rush for talent, both in front and behind the screens. And it was, for a short time, I think, it was like a gold rush, essentially. And you recently made headlines in the trade press by declaring an emergency over the unprecedented lack of work in the unscripted sector so far this year. Tell us a little bit about what it's been like as a freelancer then, from the beginning of lockdown to where we are now.
Obviously, the beginning of the pandemic, we all know the industry essentially shut down. There were issues for freelancers without financial support who didn't fall into the furlough scheme or didn't fall into the self-employment support scheme. But then, as you say, post-pandemic, we came into a huge boom period, which is great to an extent, but there's a limit to, as a freelancer, how much you can capitalise on a boom period, because you tend to work one job long term. So you might get an increase in your rate because you're in demand, but you're not able to capitalise as in work 2 or 3 jobs. And actually, yes, it was a boom period, but it was very difficult for production companies. And as someone who manages production teams and employs lots and lots and lots of freelancers on lots and lots of productions was actually really difficult because there was such a small pool of people, if at all, to kind of employ from, because everyone was employed. And it was, I think I had maybe a year to 18 months of very rarely being able to find a production manager or a line producer available when I needed them on a production for the entire period with the right kind of experience. And that actually creates its own issues. You might step up and experience people. One production, I stepped in myself and production managed it with a very junior coordinator. That has its own issues when you're trying to do your own job alongside. The boom is good for a short period, but we're not able to capitalise on it enough as freelancers. So you've worked for solidly, I don't know, for a year, 9 months, and then you hit what we hit. We think it started the back end of last year, the beginning of this year, where there's nothing. And you don't necessarily see that coming. We all know January is quiet, possibly February. By March, it's normally picking up. Those of us that have been around for a long time are used to that, but it kind of got to April and it got to May and now we're in June. And it's very, very difficult to manage. You know, for me, it's how can we go to this absolute, I call it feast to famine, almost overnight.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a really difficult start to the year. When I say start to the year, it's been a really difficult first half of the year for lots of freelancers. And so what led us to propose the motion at conference, which declared the emergency in unscripted, was because we were being contacted by members who were saying, I'm really struggling right now. This is really unusual. And so look, maybe we were a bit slow to pick up on it as well. Actually, I'll definitely hold my hands up anyway and say, look, we should have noticed it a bit sooner. But then when we started to dig a little bit deeper, it was lots and lots of people saying exactly the same thing. And look, people have been struggling to pay their bills. People are looking for jobs elsewhere. I mean, I literally just opened up one Facebook group that I'm on, and there's a conversation about this, and people are talking about sharing survival plans with each other. You know, these are people who are really established in the industry already. You know, they're professionals who've learnt their craft, who've learnt their trade, and they're talking about what your side hustle is, or what do you do when it's really quiet. And I think, as an industry, we need to talk about that. But anyway, what that led us to was to propose the motion about declaring the emergency. And look, I know that some people have a problem with the word emergency. This is a real emergency if you are a freelancer at home and you can't pay your bills and you're thinking, I don't want to work in this industry anymore. So it is an immediate emergency in that respect. But actually, I think it is a bit of an emergency. It's certainly a crisis for the wider industry at whole. If you want to have really experienced and good people on your team in the future. Because if people go and we lose that experience and that talent behind the camera, then actually in the long run, that's going to cost more money as you have to crew up people who are less experienced, and inevitably people will make mistakes because they are less experienced, and that ends up costing more money. And so that's what led us to declare that emergency. And actually it's resonated in a way that we never imagined it would do when that happened. And so that's been picked up on everywhere, you know, in the press in a way that nothing else that we've done has. And also the WhatsApp groups that I'm in with the freelancers, they're all talking about it. And actually, it's made people realize that we are doing something as a branch as well. And lots of people are coming to us, and we're having interactions now with hundreds and actually thousands of people. We recently did a Snap survey. You probably saw the results. We found that only 45% of people who answered the survey are currently working in unscripted programs who are freelancers. We found that only half of freelancers saw themselves still working in TV in 5 years' time, which I think is another thing that we need to talk about. And so I suppose there were two things that I hoped would happen as a result of declaring the emergency. One is the immediate crisis and talking about that and getting that conversation going with the broadcasters, which actually is happening, thankfully. And there are discussions happening now between different parties, which I don't think I can say any more than that, but it has opened a door which perhaps wasn't open before, which I think is a positive thing. And I think also the second part of that is that what I would like us all to do is, as an industry, come together and talk about this going forward. How do we avoid this happening in the future? Or how do we have an honest conversation about it? Because there's a lot of freelancers who are just expecting it because they're all being told, I'll just wait a little while longer, just a few more weeks, and there'll be more stuff coming through. And if you're a freelancer and you're told that, you take that at face value. And I think actually it would be better if broadcasters just said, we're not going to commission anything for 6 months. And then it would mean we're in an honest place, and freelancers could go, okay, well, that's not great, but at least I know that if I go away and get a job for 6 months, I can come back and work in TV, when that time period is over. So I suppose we're waiting for that second phase to happen now, fingers crossed.
But just picking up on the declaration of an emergency, isn't this simply causing more panic in the market and actually having an adverse effect where, maybe it's providing a smokescreen for some TV businesses to maybe cut their overheads and make staff redundant, where they can say, hey, listen, you've seen there's an emergency being called. Obviously, there may be some more unscrupulous production businesses out there that might do that sort of thing, not suggesting everybody would. Couldn't it also have an adverse effect when, in the same way that you can talk yourself into a recession? Isn't it a little bit dangerous using those sort of phrases as emergency, for example?
We aren't recording video on this, but if we were, you'd see that I was making a bit of a face there. No, I don't agree with that, Justin, at all. I think if you're a freelancer and you hear there's been an emergency declared, you're not immediately going to go, right, okay, that's it now. Tomorrow, I'm never going to work in TV ever again. I'm going to go and walk off and get my next career. So I don't think it's going to stop people who are very experienced and talented at their job from working in TV anymore, if that's what people are suggesting. Because I think if jobs do start to come through, and I really, really hope they do in the next few days and weeks, then you're not going to go, oh, actually, guys, I've signed up to go and work in a different industry. Sorry, I'm off. I don't think you're going to do that. That's not going to happen. Yeah, if you are a business, if you're a small indie and you use an emergency declared by a union to cut costs, then I think there's probably a bigger thing going on there. I think by declaring an emergency, we've done exactly what the freelancers wanted us to do, which was tell the industry, hey, we're hurting right now. We're really struggling. We can't get by, and we need to talk about this. And that's thankfully what we've spent the last week or so doing.
Viki, what sort of stories are you hearing from your members and the issues that they're facing?
We're hearing lots of different things. I mean, it's interesting how James and I came to talking about, okay, something is going on that's not normal, that isn't your normal January, February. I mean, as James talks about, he heard it on some WhatsApp groups. And the interesting thing for me was that I suddenly found I'm on a lot of forums for production staff, and for the first time in about 18 months, people were posting up that they were coming available, and then there were more and more of these posts, whereas for the previous year to 18 months, it had been people like me saying, does anyone know any production managers, coordinators available in the next XYZ? So it sort of came about, and then we're just hearing it's a variety of different experiences. For some people, it's common to finish contract at Christmas. I started hearing from some people I know that, it's February now. Have you heard of anything? Is there anything coming up? So people that have been out of work for 5 or 6 months now. I work in a sort of slightly ad hoc way. I don't tend to do long contracts anymore. Other people I know who work in a similar way, where they might work part-time for a short while and might work for lots of different companies doing small jobs, are just finding there's less of those jobs than they would normally expect. And the other thing that I'm hearing the most is we're just not getting the phone calls anymore. So a year ago, even though I was in a really long-term contract, I was getting calls all the time. When are you free? When are you next available? We've got this coming up. People aren't talking to people about commissions and work happening. And so that sort of feeds as well, this sense of when's it going to end? Because I think that's the real thing for freelancers is, for me, I accept as a freelancer that there are peaks and troughs. There's been peaks and troughs my entire career, and there are busy periods and quiet periods, and I try and save. But the hardest thing in a quiet period, I think, is never knowing when it's going to end. And like I say, you sort of assume by March you'll be okay, and we're now in June and we're hearing, that people aren't. And the other thing that I'm hearing, which is really worrying, is experienced people saying, if this goes on much longer, I need to go and find what we all refer to as a proper job, because, and I don't mean that in a sneery way to jobs in TV, because actually for me, when I say I've got to go and find a proper job, what I mean is, I might have to go and find a really boring job that isn't working in the TV industry, like a real job that means I don't get to have all the fun that I get to have having my, I love working in TV. It's what I've been doing it so long, and it's why I'm still here. So the thought of what I consider a proper job or a grown-up job or whatever you want to call it, but you hear a lot of people kind of saying, I'm going to have to think about that. And that's worrying for the industry.
We aren't unrealistic. We're not saying that overnight all the broadcasters should fix this by just commissioning any old crap. The first thing that's on their in tray from a production company with a pitch. So we aren't saying that you should just commission anything and everything. We understand that we need to have a sustainable ecosystem within the industry, and that's something that we want to talk about and be part of that conversation, and that's the thing that I think is really, really important, is that freelancers themselves are all in this conversation. And look, we also know if you're from an underrepresented group, we know that any of these scenarios are exacerbated by that. So basically, usually people who are at the intersections, people who are already struggling with other issues within the industry, we know that commissioning slowdowns affect people even more at those points, don't we, Viki?
Yeah, and also I think in terms of the broadcasters and the indies, the production companies, is we understand it. We understand it's not a bottomless pit of money. We understand advertising budgets are being cut. The BBC's had its licence frozen. Netflix, Amazon, dependent on subscriber numbers. We're not expecting there to permanently be a big pot of money, but what we're saying is there a way that this can work more sustainably? This idea that last year we were all so busy that we were working solidly, but also receiving lots of phone calls. Those of us that were trying to employ couldn't find staff. Could the broadcasters look longer terms at that? I'm hearing that lots of the broadcasters have got programmes on the shelf that were made last year that haven't yet been aired. Could those programmes actually have been made at the beginning of this year? Could it have been spread out in a different way? Now, I don't know what the answers are, but if we can talk to the broadcasters and the indies and everyone understands each other's experience, because I think it's important as well that freelancers understand the commercial pressures that a broadcaster or a production company is under. That all needs to work, as James said, this idea of a kind of sustainable ecosystem for everyone involved. But that can't happen if we're not communicating and we're not explaining to each other, these are our issues. Well, actually, these are our issues from a broadcaster perspective. Where can we meet in the middle? That to me is the ultimate answer, and to have those channels of communication open.
You're right. There are three groups here, essentially, who have to work as an ecosystem. They might say there were reports following COVID that some of the US streamers were pumping huge budgets into productions and sometimes offering production companies and therefore freelancers huge increases to poach freelancers from other productions or gazump producers. And this has led to maybe a bit of a breakdown of trust between producers and freelance staff. What do you say to those who don't have much sympathy for freelancers who may have been demanding 3 or 4 times what they would usually earn during the boom time, and now it's like, well, you had a good time a few months ago. It's kind of market forces, boom and bust.
I don't know how many people that actually applies to, Justin. I don't know how many people are getting 3 or 4 times what their normal rate is. I think some people might have been able to get a premium for a short while. I mean, Viki can probably talk about numbers here, but I'm guessing it certainly wasn't even probably double. But look, I think most responsible production managers, and again, Viki can talk about this, wouldn't give a freelancer double their normal rate. And certainly I don't know anyone at all who was getting anywhere near those kind of figures. But I'll let Viki jump in and say a little bit more detail on that.
I don't know the detail of the numbers on that. We did see some increases. I've never seen anything like double, let alone triple or more. And the other thing to flag is when you talk about market forces, in the middle of probably the highest demand for production managers I've ever seen, there was also a campaign started by Jamie Stratton, a production manager, for pay parity for production managers with editorial freelancers. So even though there was huge demand, production management were not commanding huge rates. So we seem to work in a slightly odd world where demand doesn't always necessarily translate into hugely increased rates. And the other thing I would say to that is that much as we're saying to the broadcasters, we want to come to the table and tell you what the freelancers are dealing with, come and talk to us, broadcasters and streamers. If that is your experience and you feel that, you pumped lots of money in and everyone had a lovely time, and now the result of that is where we are, then we and the producers, the indies, should all be involved in that conversation. If we're not talking to each other and understanding each other's experiences, we can't work together fruitfully, going forwards.
And maybe, Viki, in TV terms, that's a nice segue to talk about our current campaign, which is called the Worth It campaign, Justin. So basically, I don't know if you know about this, but earlier this year, there was an open letter that was written and circulated by one of our members. And it got over 1,000 signatures overnight, pretty much, in a very short space of time. And there are a list of things that we want to talk about with the broadcasters. And this is obviously before the emergency was declared, when we knew that this year was going to be as quiet as it is. But the first thing on there is pay parity between editorial and production. And that's something that we're really passionate about with everything that we're doing. And then another thing on there is talk about the talent pipeline, because back in the day that we already talked about before, where it was mostly staff members making TV programmes. I remember when I first started out, I'd have a 6 monthly review. I was working at the BBC in children's programmes, and they'd sit you down every 6 months and you'd talk about what your career goals were, and you'd come up with a path to get there. There isn't any of that happening now because we are all freelancers, and that's something that's really important. But I think it sort of ties into this whole conversation that we're having about the industry and some of the issues that are going on with it, because no one is stepping back and taking a holistic view about this. And I honestly think there are so many inefficiencies that freelancers can give their perspective on, that we can give our perspective on as a branch of the union, that would actually help save money in the long run. That there are things that I think we can all talk about that and our perspective that we can bring to the table that I think would actually be very useful to a lot of the broadcasters, because we can see things in a way that they can't. And I think that's an important perspective to take in when you think about these things.
So looking at the unscripted industry as a whole, plus the even bigger macro issues that we've got out there, we've got a global cost of living crisis. There's a number of factors that are causing that, obviously on the back of COVID, Ukrainian war, various other governmental decisions, not only here but around the world. And these have all been affecting commercial broadcasters and tech companies. We've seen the BBC under pressure to cut costs and slash programming. Major studios and Channel 4 seems to be imposing kind of commissioning moratorium right now. The issues that freelancers are facing, isn't it simply the case that the traditional TV industry as we knew it is getting smaller and it's continuing to shrink? It has been over the years and it's going to shrink over the coming years. And therefore the workforce needed will also be smaller.
But where was that 6 months ago? 6 months ago, we were all busy and there was lots and lots of work out there, and you couldn't find, as an employer, freelancers for love nor money. So it's that up and down. And if we are on a down, also let's talk about that then with the broadcasters and the streamers. If that is the long-term view, then as an industry, we do need to look at that if the workforce does need to be smaller. But I struggle with the idea that we went from a position we were in last year to where we are now. And I may be wrong. I don't know the answers, but there's just no reason not to be having the conversations, because if it is going to be smaller because of all those outside pressures, then that's also something that we need to talk about and work out as a union. We represent the freelancers of our industry. If there are hard things to hear, we need to be involved in that conversation.
When it comes to the unscripted TV union and industry bodies like PACT and broadcasters, is there a broadcaster organisation that you talk to, broadcasters as a whole, or is there any sort of discussions going on with individual broadcasters as well as PACT, for example, or are those conversations just simply not happening at the moment?
they're probably happening unofficially. I don't know what official channels there are. There certainly isn't a broadcaster organisation that we can just go to and have that discussion. I mean, maybe there should be. Maybe that would be a useful thing. I don't know, because then at least we'd have someone to go to directly to have these conversations with. There are certain things like that. Obviously, there's the Coalition for Change, a group that meets currently once a year to talk about freelancers, which does involve broadcasters and other groups. So I think the changes that ultimately we need to have a conversation about, we need to be talking to the people at the very, very top of the industry. You know, I'm talking about chief executives, I'm talking about director generals, because I think they are currently unaware of the issues that so many freelancers are facing. And I think that by having that conversation, it coming from the top, we can be more open and more honest about it. And I think that's a really important thing. And I think that any conversations that do happen only go up to a certain level. Currently, there are no big changes that are going to happen. And like Viki said, if there is a shrinking of the industry, okay, well, it's not a great thing to hear, but let's be honest about it and have that conversation, because then people can perhaps make bigger decisions about their life. And if TV isn't seen as a full-time, year-round career anymore, then I think that says more about our industry and other problems within it than it does about anything else. And I think that it comes back to this sustainable ecosystem that I mentioned. And I think that we need to have that conversation and be part of that.
So the solution you're suggesting to the crisis and the emergency that you called in the unscripted TV freelance market is essentially conversation. You're calling for a conversation with broadcasters at senior executive level to understand how things, in their view, I mean, obviously nobody's got a crystal ball, but you would imagine that some commercial broadcasters can see how things are going to play out over the next 24 months, for example, whether that be the advertising market, whether that's actually going to come back to any significant degree or not, you know, how they're going to be approaching that when it comes to shareholders, how much content they're going to be commissioning, what are the levels of budgets they're going to be allocating to that. And all of that can presumably help with, for production companies, budgeting, understanding what they can afford and what they can't afford, and how many staff they can afford, on what basis they can employ staff. And so it's essentially a conversation. You're calling for more discussion.
I mean, at a basic level, yes. I think that the thing that we really need to talk about, that I would like to have a very honest conversation with the people at the very top of the industry, is about commissioning tariffs. And broadcasters, the cliche goes, constantly want more for less. So great, you made a brilliant, successful series one. What other industry would you then say, okay, make a second successful series, but do it for less money? It's like, well, if something's successful, surely you want to throw more money at it. But actually, the problem is that the production companies are under a lot of pressure to say yes. And so they say yes, even though they probably can't necessarily do it for that rate. And so they obviously have to look for other funding, and we know that happens. But usually what I think happens is that the freelancers at the bottom get squeezed as a result of that. Because when you're asking anyone to do something for less, the breakage has to happen somewhere. And currently that's happening at the freelancer level, because what you're going to do as a production company is you're going to squeeze everything that you possibly can out of everyone. And I'm not saying that's done maliciously at all, but I'm just saying, of course, you're going to have a negotiation with a freelancer and you're going to ask them to take £100 a week less or something. And if you're doing that across the board, that is going to have an impact on your budget, obviously. But look, we're all professionals here. We have built up years and years of experience, and we're bringing that wealth of experience to the programs that we're making. We're often told we're the creative lifeblood of the industry. And so it doesn't make sense to me that you would expect people to do something for less and that you would constantly try to squeeze everything out of it.
Yeah.
And so I actually think I'm just going to put this out there now, and maybe I should regret saying this. I actually think that the independent producers need to be more honest with the broadcasters and say, hey guys, we can't make this program, we can't make this series for that budget, because it's not fair on our freelancers and it's not fair on us. So no one's saying that though. No one's honest enough to say it. So anyway, I might regret saying that, but I'm going to say it. So there we go.
A lot of conversations that I have with producers, I mean, they're having these conversations, they're pitching and they're desperately trying to sell their shows and pitching their shows. And what's becoming more and more common to my mind is that a broadcaster may say, we love this idea, we can't afford it, we haven't got the budget for it, we'll stick 50% in. And so then a producer's got to go, right, okay, so where's the other 50% going to come from? And they may then need to spend, or they will need to spend if they want to make the show, another 2 months, 5 months, 6 months, getting a Canadian partner or an Australian partner or another partner to make up that budget. And then at that point, they may have to pull the trigger and say, okay, we've only got 8% of the budget. We have to reduce the budget. And then if this show is going to happen, it's not the original show we want. So there's so many shifting parts and so many people involved. When in scripted, I suppose it's a slightly different conversation. In scripted, I feel that amount of programming being made and seemingly the tariffs are reducing as well. It's the producers are getting squeezed and the freelancers are getting squeezed as well. It's a tough situation.
Yeah, I mean, if the only way you can make a program is by essentially exploiting the freelancers who are the ones who are doing the day-to-day and making that program, then obviously there are bigger issues there. And yes, I do use the word exploitation because we are constantly hearing about stories from real people whose lives are really affected by these things, who do feel exploited and are finding things difficult when they are working. And so yeah, that is something that we also need to talk about. So this comes back to the conversation that we'd like to have, Justin, with the people at the top of the broadcasters.
It also comes back to James mentioned right at the top about the scripted drama area of TV and film have terms and conditions and we don't. It's much more difficult to exploit people if there are written down agreed terms and conditions. And we almost need a reset as an industry because things like hours that are considered a normal, usual amount of hours to work on a particular show aren't acceptable, but because it doesn't say it anywhere and because those of us who are old enough to have been around a long time can tell loads of war stories about how it was worse and you worked on something where you didn't get a weekend off for 3 months or whatever your war story is, it normalises it. And that's a problem. And so all of these things feed into each other and are part of the same conversation, which is if we were talking to the broadcasters and Pact and the indies and we started talking about terms and conditions, we could have much better conversations. I mean, I have never worked in drama, but I know if you work on a drama, you look very closely at the hours that you're filming and what your overtime bill might be because there are agreed terms for that and you don't have an option. For example, in our part of the industry, you might say, well, actually, we'll let the crew go after their 10 or 12 hour day. But this producer director who's not on overtime, who has got a camera, he can carry on filming and pick up those last few interviews or GVs or whatever it is that we need to do at the end of the day. So it's all part of the same conversation, really.
And all those things, Justin, are something that we are talking about in our Worth It campaign. These are all conversations that we want to have because we would like to ultimately see agreed terms and conditions for unscripted freelancers, because I think we all deserve to have those arranged terms and conditions so we all know where we stand, basically. And I actually think, weirdly, it might end up making budgets a bit easier because, like Viki said, in scripted, you know how much it's going to cost you if you go over a certain amount of time. Yeah, and it's all about parity and fairness, really. And, if you've got one part of the industry, i.e. scripted, who do have these agreed terms and conditions, why is that acceptable to not have an agreement in unscripted programs? It just doesn't make any sense when you look at it like that. And look, I understand why there are historical reasons why it is the way it is. And again, I'm not suggesting that there is any malice in any of this, but let's talk about it.
Obviously, there's a strike going on in the States within scripted at the moment, and there's lots of speculation that that's going to lead to a bit of a reboot for unscripted, maybe a higher demand for unscripted program to fill all of those programming hours in the States. So you never know. We might be in a boom time again by Christmas, and we might be at the top of the roller coaster again.
I'd like, if we do go into a boom time, for it not to be at the expense of other parts of the industry. It would be great. And I know that's utopia. But if the boom could be across the board, not because another part of the industry is suffering.
And obviously, Bectu has publicly declared solidarity with the striking workers over in America. So, I think
difficult one for you guys.
I think we'd have. It is a difficult one for us on that respect. Yeah,
it's a bit uncomfortable for us. We'd like not to capitalise on somebody else's misfortune.
Viki and James, it's been fantastic speaking with you. Thank you very much. It's really interesting to hear about the challenges the unscripted TV industry freelance community is feeling at the moment, the challenge that they're feeling and what's going on there. We get the feeling that the change is happening ever more quickly now. So let's hope that you do have those discussions that you need and those conversations that you need, and to build that ecosystem and certain levels of rights that you need to acquire for your members as well. And let's hope that, we can all move forward, and when things stabilize in the market, then everybody's in a better position. So thank you so much indeed for joining me on TellyCast this week, and good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Cheers, Justin.
Well, that's all for this week's TellyCast. As always, thanks a lot for listening. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers and recorded in London. We'll see you next week. Until then, stay safe.